Hi there, and welcome to Season 1, Episode 14 of Flip the Script, Why SDR Churn is so unfortunately high and what you can do to prevent it. My name is Becc Holland. I'm the CEO and founder of Flip the Script. Before we jump in, if you do me a favor, go to flipthescript.co and download the deck so you can follow along. Let's jump in. SDR, by and large, is unfortunately a very grind role. It's a really, really tough role where you're having to constantly face the idea of rejection, come in front of prospects that have never heard of you before, talk to people in a compelling way right off the bat and try and strike rapport just enough to set an appointment. And unlike an account executive, that is when your job is done. Is just setting the appointment, making sure that your prospect comes to the meeting and is super well prepared and, actually shows up to the meeting. And so because of that, the wear and tear on an SDR from an emotional perspective and from a physical perspective is very, very high. So when it comes to keeping an SDR in a role, keeping an SDR, motivated, empowered throughout the role, it's a really, really tough job to do. And the churn can be anywhere from 6 months on the short end, I've heard for enterprise firms, all the way to on the very long end, 2 years in the role before the SDR is ready to move on. So because of that, I think that companies need to be very, very intentional about what they're doing in the process and how can they really meet the SDRs where they're at. Really supply them, enable them, empower them so that they want to stay in the role for as long as possible so that you can get the most bang for your buck, if you will, with an SDR. And they feel super empowered while we're there. So let's jump into how you can achieve that as they are moving up to become an account executive is the role that we're going to use in this case scenario because it's the most, quote unquote, logical path or most common path from what I've seen from SDRs. We're going to break it down into 4 buckets. So step 1, is they are an SDR. So this can either be junior SDR. Sometimes I've even seen a transition from BDR of an inbound rep into an outbound SDR. But we're going to take step 1 as they are an outbound SDR and that is their full role. So the first step that I do is with my SDRs that are coming in off the bat, maybe they're coming in right out of school or this is their first sales development role. Then I tell them that the first thing that will make them eligible to move on to step number 2 is they hit quota for 6 months post ramp. So ramp usually can be anywhere from a month to 3 months of what I've seen in the industry. That's typically what I say is 3 months for a ramp where people are ramping into the quota. But after the ramp is complete, I say if you hit your quota for 6 months, it doesn't have to be back to back to back or sequential, but if you hit your quota for 6 months, then that gives you, is one of the requirements for you to be eligible to move on to step number 2, which is the senior SDR. But first things first, that is the most important usually to an SDR leader. So that's the most important for the SDRs to hit that, hit their quota for 6 months. I typically say it has to be post ramp, but as a caveat and asterisk mark, with my SDRs, typically on my teams, to really instigate them to want to, make the drive and book the meetings right off the bat, especially if it's someone who has done it before and is coming into this SDR role, I will say, hey, it needs to be 6 months of quota attainment post-ramp. However, if you hit a full month of quota attainment, meaning, let's say that for instance, the quota is going to be 15 appointments. And so in month 1, it's 0, month 2, it's 5, month 3, it's 10, and then a full ramped bag is 15. I'll tell them if in month, 2 or 3, you do hit 15 appointments and you do hit a full bag, I will count that as one of the month's quota attainment post ramp, because essentially that was the full bag that I wanted. So what you want to be cognizant of here as a leader is you really need the appointments that you want. So if they get them to me earlier, within their tenure, let's say in month 1 or month 1, 2, or 3, they're just really, really good on the phones and they, get me that full ramped bag of quota attainment, then that will hit that requirement for me. That's something that I do. The second thing that I require for someone to move into a senior SDR role is that they listen to 300 calls of account executives. So one of the most valuable reservoirs of information for an SDR is what their account executives are doing to close the deal. So I always recommend that you pull on board a conversation intelligence software like Chorus, for instance, that records your account executive calls and makes them very easily diagnosable. But point being, you want to have your SDRs from a very early stage listening to the AE calls to hear what they're saying, to hear, traits within negotiation, how they're handling pricing, how they're pitching the features, how they're pitching, the entire demo from top down. But this, if you put this as a requirement to make them eligible to move on as a senior SDR, you'll see them getting into the habit very early of listening to account executive calls, which is a really, really healthy trait and will help them in their future roles. So they get to know your product much more, they get to know your platform much more, and they also get to know what's happening with the resultant calls of the demos that they set, so they can understand what a good and bad call is right off the bat. So I make that the second criterion, that they listen to 300 plus calls of account executives, and you can track how many calls they're listening to in Chorus. The third eligibility requirement is I have them pass a quote-unquote mock demo test. So I sit them down with an account executive. Usually I run like a six-week course program that an account executive runs who wants to, really lean into that nurturing or training role. And basically they will teach them how to demo. And at the end of that test, end of that section, I will basically give them a test on, can you give this demo in a mock scenario? So either you can be the judge as an SDR leader, or you can get an account executive to be the judge, maybe who ran the 6-week course. But basically, you want to make sure that your SDR knows in a mock scenario how to run a demo as one of the requirements to move on to the senior SDR role to really set them up for success. So in summary, 6 months of quota attainment post-ramp. They've listened to 300 calls within Chorus or Conversation Intelligence platform, and that they have passed this mock demo test and they know how to demo from a high level. That gives them a ticket to play, meaning I never guarantee a promotion. So this gives them a ticket to play, but there's always external requirements, but this, puts them in the right realm of, this is my expectation of what you need to do to move on to a senior SDR. Step 2, they're in the senior SDR role. So I broke this down into 3 boxes: the perks that you get from the role, the responsibility that you get from the role, and then the eligibility to get to the next stage of the game. So as a senior SDR, I obviously, number one, give them a little more money. So that can be dependent on, whatever your budget is or whatever your culture is or the expectation is there. But I've given anywhere from a 10 to 20% increase from SDR to senior SDR whenever they make that transition. So for all the money motivated SDRs out there, you're giving them, additional comp so that they really salivate after that senior SDR role. So they're wanting to crush it in the junior SDR role. The second thing that I give them as a perk, a lot of SDRs and people who are very young in their career want to learn. And that's a great characteristic. That's something that you want to foster within your SDR. So as a perk to the senior SDR, I invest typically in a third-party trainer. I bring on someone. I've brought on a myriad of different trainers in the past. I'm not going to make any necessarily recommendations. But a third-party trainer is someone who's coming outside from the organization, can teach them about account executive calls, can teach them how to sell full cycle, can teach them on a myriad of different things, whether that's prospecting habits to how to close a deal. But if I am going to invest third-party training into someone, it's very expensive usually. So I'm going to make sure that my SDR has done the groundwork of hitting quota first, and I usually train them on my in-house program to make sure that they have the investment of wanting to learn. So I'm going to make the investment back by bringing someone in from the outside that can help them understand how to sell from a high level. And then the third perk that comes along with becoming a senior SDR is title. So especially at the beginning of your career, a lot of people really value title and getting that little bump. So, putting the word senior in front of SDR usually is pretty encouraging to them that they get that elevated title. So those are the perks. As far as the responsibilities, apart from having an increased bag, an increased quota that they usually have associated with it, I have them, number one, run onboarding classes with new SDRs. This can be really helpful if you're a leader and you need some help. If you don't want to run all the onboarding classes or you don't have the bandwidth. A lot of SDR leaders, especially within SMB and mid-market, they're overtaxed with direct reports and they don't have enough enablement. So this can be a really good way to get your SDRs to teach these new SDRs and to also offload a little bit of the work and the brunt whenever you're doing onboarding. I actually talked to an SDR leader yesterday that is onboarding five reps per month and also running his team, and he has no equipment when it comes to any kind of onboarding program or any kind of sessions or any kind of sales enablement outside of what he's doing. So this is really, really helpful way to alleviate that. Number one, it helps your senior SDR really invest in someone else and teaches them how to teach if they ever want to go into leadership. But number two, it can take some of the brunt off of you as a leader. Number two is I give them an SDR buddy. So I put them into a pair, whenever a new SDR comes on board, you want to have someone who's really invested, not in a group sense, but in an individual sense, in how well they're doing, questions that they have, anything from product knowledge to how they're handling objections to, software that they're deploying or implementing within their role. But you basically want to pair them up into SDR buddies to where they have someone from the very get-go. The new SDR has someone from the very get-go that they can come to for questions. So this can be really helpful for someone feeling like they're really at home and getting all their questions addressed. Every person is different. They're going to excel in some things and struggle in some things. And so an SDR buddy can be really, really helpful to get the new SDR rolling. But also, again, like I mentioned, as a senior SDR, if you want to move into leadership or BDR leadership one day, then this is a great way to start investing in someone else other than yourself. So you're not just focused on your individual contributor bag, but you're also focused on making someone else successful. One of the hardest things for me when I became a leader was I was an individual contributing AE before. So I was inherently, I'm going to admit this on camera, pretty selfish. I focused on my bag. If I was hitting quota, if I was closing deals, if I was getting pipeline, et cetera, but I didn't think about other people until I really had to out of necessity. I remember the CRO who made me an SDR leader basically came to me and said, "Hey, we want you to lead a global team." And my response to him was, "Can you tell me why? Because I think that I'm too focused on myself to be a leader." And it was the truth in that case. And he said, "I'll never forget, whether you're selfish or not is another conversation for another time, but I do see that you love coaching because I see you coaching other SDRs and I see you coaching the account executives for the calls that you set. So let's bank on that and let's move forward." So I had to go through the mental transition of, instead of it just being about, am I hitting my quota? Am I getting what I need? Am I getting what I want? And how can I make some strides forward? It became a game about other people. And so to kind of like soften that role or soften that transition, I think having an SDR buddy and someone else that you're not necessarily accountable for, but you're invested in, can be really helpful. And it can also, again, take a little bit of the brunt off of you as an SDR leader if you have your SDRs paired together. And then the third responsibility that I give them when they're a senior SDR is that they can run a bi-weekly product webinar where I send the unqualified leads from the inbound. So if you want to know more about that process, go to the inbound process session where I cover, how the demo flow works. But this is basically high level a demo where I'm sending the unqualified leads so they still know my product, but we don't spend account executive time on it. So this can be a great way for your senior SDR to get to know how to demo in a live environment. In step one, they got to know it in tests in the mock demo. And then in this environment, they get to run something that's live. And so it's a good way for them to get training whenever their heart's thumping. And so there's nothing like the reality in the real life. So let's talk about eligibility to move into the next role. Again, I'm going to envision in this case scenario that the next role for them is an account executive. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily the truth certainly for all SDRs or even the majority. I've promoted into CSM before. I've promoted even into a solutions engineer before, promoted into HR and marketing. But for this case scenario, let's assume that the SDR wants to move into an account executive role into the full-time seller. So the things that I ask for in terms of what makes them eligible for promotion, again, it's a ticket to play. It's not necessarily a guarantee. But number one is quota attainment again. For all the SDRs in the line who are out there, who are watching this, you want to speak your leader's love language, if I'm making any sense. What your SDR leader is measured on is quota attainment. And what quota attainment means in the SDR role, typically for organizations, is meetings. So time and chair doesn't matter to them. I'm going to pause. Time and chair does not matter to your SDR leader. doesn't necessarily matter to them how long you've been at the organization. What matters to them is how much value that you've driven in terms of quota attainment. Because when they walk into, quarterly reviews or annual reviews or with the sales leader, that's what their sales leader cares about. So I would get very, very monomaniacal about how do I produce in terms of quota, not thinking that you deserve to move on because you've been at that company for a year or 2 years. So this has been a big frustration point, I feel like, for a lot of SDRs that I've seen, is they've called me and said like, hey, my leader is not promoting me. And I said, okay, talk to me about quota attainment. And they're like, well, quota attainment aside, I feel like I've done all these other initiatives. Like I've helped with onboarding SDRs, and I've helped with, our marketing collateral, and I've helped with buyer persona material. And I'm like, right, but tell me about quota attainment. They're like, well, I'm mediocre in terms of quota attainment. And I'm like, well, that's where you need to focus. That's what your leader cares about. So you want to strive to make your leader look really, really good. And how you do that is there. So the first requirement, again, for eligibility that I put is quota attainment for 6 months. You won't have ramp in this case, but quota attainment for 6 months, if it's internal, quota attainment for 6 months. They listen to 600 calls. And then the last point that I put here is that they go through an AE training program. So I've had the luxury of having really, really great account executives that I work for. Shout out to Devin Liu over at Chorus. Absolutely amazing. He ran this incredible 3-month program for SDRs just to help them to get to know our product better for the benevolence of the team. So if you don't have an AE training program for your SDRs, I would certainly invest in one, try to develop one where they get to know your product in a very, very granular way. So when they're ready to become an account executive, which in SDR world is a very, very short tenure, they have the skills and are ready to slip into that role. Step number 3 is going to be junior AE or ISR. I've heard them called both. So this is where it gets really interesting. A lot of people for junior AEs in this transition, they'll say like, okay, well, we'll make them an SMB or a micro SMB rep. But what happens if you don't really sell into micro SMB? Or what happens if you don't sell into SMB in general? You certainly can't have a junior AE or junior ISR calling into enterprise. So what do? I want to make sure that they really can do the job. So they've gone through the mock demo, they've gone through the biweekly product webinar, they know how to demo the product, they've gone through the AE training program, and they really know how to prospect. So something that I usually incorporate into the ISR junior AE program is like, okay, the perks are you're in a full closing role now, you're closing all of these deals, you've got the increased money, of course, and then the elevated title of now the heavens have parted and the sun has shone upon you, and now you're an account executive. But the responsibility portion is where I really get my SDRs rolling. If I am an AE leader, one of the things that I'm thinking about is I don't have enough pipeline. Regardless of where my pipeline's at, I want more pipeline. So one of the requirements that I put on the SDRs that are moving into a junior AE role is you need to prove yourself. Prove that you can close. And when you do that, prove that you can still source pipeline in the meantime. So instead of sending over all of this inbound pipeline to this junior AE, I save that pipeline a lot of times for the account executives who have earned it in terms of tenure. They've been an account executive for a long time. They've proven themselves that they know how to prospect. But, we want to take a little bit of that weight off of them of like, okay, you're full-time closing deals. That's where your expertise is. And also, you've kind of paid your dues a little bit. So a junior AE, this is a major step up for an SDR of like, they're not full-time prospecting. Now they're closing deals. I still hold them accountable to the metric that they need to source 75% of their own pipeline. This is going to do 2 things to this person. Number 1, it is going to get them into the habit of self-prospecting, so you don't go through the dangerous chasm of they just stop prospecting and suck up the inbound pipeline. But number 2, it's going to enhance your pipeline because now you have the inbound coming through the SDR, but the junior AE really needs to create their own pipeline, and so you get both. You have the inbound coming from the SDR, and you also have the junior AE who's responsible for sourcing their own deals, so you can pass those inbound deals to your full-time closer or to your account executives. So I put the requirement that they must source 75%. I mean, you can change this number as much as you want. I'm kind of mean and known as the snow queen, so I put it at 75. But if you want to change it to 50% or 25%, I mean, you get it, the principle's still there. But I also put the requirement that the inbound pipeline is pulled entirely if that junior AE doesn't hit their self-source quota. So you don't want to just put it as a recommendation or a friendly suggestion that they source. You want to say like, hey, you need to source 75% of your pipeline or 50% of your pipeline. If you don't hit that metric, we're not going to talk about it or argue or get mad at one another. You're just going to have all of the inbound pipeline pulled from you. So now instead of 25% of your pipeline coming from SDR and 75% coming from you, or 50 and 50, it's now going to be 100% you in the next month, and you're still responsible for the same bag. So this holds you. I actually pulled this tip from a little known company that rhymes with LinkedIn. But basically you want to get your SDR, you want to get your junior AEs very, very responsible for their own fate, very responsible for their own bag, and not relying all the time on inbound coming in, because it's great for you as an organization. So you can, again, put this number at whatever you want, 50%, 25%, 10%, but you want to make sure that they don't lose that muscle of prospecting for the betterment of your organization and the betterment for that rep long-term. Eligibility is quota attainment for a year is what I would put it at. It's a little different than SDR. So SDR is, again, very, very low tenure, high churn. And so you want to make sure not only are you rewarding your SDR through the entire process with training, with enablement, with all of these account executive sessions, with accountability, you're rewarding them with accountability, money, elevated title, but you want to keep them going a little on the back end. So they don't have to be a junior AE forever, but I would put the minimum of a year, but quota attainment for a year post ramp, because they will have a ramp as an account executive, at least from what I've seen. And you can put them into an SMB market, micro SMB, et cetera. You pick the discipline in the field based on your company. But I would suggest that it's not just 6 months, because as a junior AE, you want a little bit more squeeze out of the orange, if I'm making any sense. Step 4 is you've got a full-blown account executive. So the perk is that they're in a full closing role with more inbound pipeline. They have increased dollars to the account executive role, and they have an elevated title. And they source only the pipeline that they need to, as a responsibility aspect, they source only the pipeline that they need to make up in the delta. I think there needs to be a, I'm going to say this on record, wave of accountability with closers. You need to own your bag. I talked to a CEO the other day of a Forbes unicorn company, hyper-growth company, about to IPO, incredible firm, and he told me the following story. He said that he was sitting at his desk and that an account executive walked up to his desk. He is the CEO of this organization and built this organization off of the sweat of his own back and blood, sweat, and tears. And this AE walked up to him and said, "Hey, I need more pipeline to hit my quota." AEs need to be responsible and accountable for their bag, regardless of what pipeline comes from sales development. Sales development is a great mechanism that can produce amazing results, and so is marketing with the demo requests. But an AE always needs to keep in mind that pipeline that is generated for them is a gift, not a right. So you always are going to be responsible for the pipeline that you can't make up in the delta. So if I need 20 appointments and I go into a session in season 2, full sneak peek of how you can do this and calculate out the math of what you need in the delta on average, how many appointments you need to get there, and what's the activity that will make it happen. But you just need to walk in with the mindset that regardless of what my bag is and regardless of the SDR support that I get, I need to make up that delta. And if I have so much inbound that I hit the quota on it, that's great, but I need to be accountable for it. So I put the responsibility here for an AE is always that you make up and you self-source the delta of pipeline that you're not receiving from sales development. And I put the same I put the same requirement here that the inbound pipeline is pulled entirely if they don't hit the self-source quota. And I would put 4 or 5 months on this of like, okay, they consistently aren't hitting their bag and they're not self-sourcing as well, that I would pull the inbound pipeline from them and keep the quota the same. So again, Snow Queen here, but really my focus is how do I make the entire revenue funnel? How do I make the entire revenue engine make it happen and be super accountable to one another and interdepartmentally? So that's it, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this session and you want to hear more, go to flipthescript.co so you can download some of the sales topics that we have there. And if you really like this session, go to Flip the Script on LinkedIn and be sure to tag me with your top 2 takeaways. But either way, hope you have a great rest of your day.